Hello and welcome to another episode of Diaries of a Game Coder. As promised from last week's episode, today will be episode 1.5. I'll be going over some of the terminology that I was using last week that by popular request was a little confusing to some of you out there. So today we'll be covering everything terminology wise that I was mentioning in last week's episode. Let's get started. Alright, so I think the best way to get an overview and to get a good grip on the terminology I used in last week's episode is by looking at this overall computer architecture chart that I was drawing here on the left, on the right, my right, which is your left, to the left of me from your side. Let's see, so what we have here, any kind of computer interaction always starts with the user. The user has to initiate the interaction by either turning on the power or pressing something on the keyboard, pressing something on the joystick, or the mouse. As this is reflected here in the diagram, if you look at the user's input starts with keyboard, mouse, or joystick in this particular diagram, and that then gets transmitted to the peripheral interface. Every computer has some kind of a computer hardware that's dedicated to handle any kind of user input, whether it be the keyboard, and then the keyboard would have a keyboard controller, which is basically a chip that decodes the keyboard presses, which then get passed on to the rest of the computer. Likewise, with the mouse detects or sends its current position to the USB controller via USB interface. In the old days, it was kind of specialized, like the Commodore Amiga mouse had a different kind of serial interface, but they're all in principle the same type of thing. The idea is that the device, whether it be the keyboard, the mouse, or the joystick, have some kind of state that then gets interpreted by the peripheral interface, whether it be hardware or just a single chip, for further processing down on, which gets us to the next piece of the computer or video game console, which is also the most important piece. Without that thing, nothing would happen, literally. The central processing unit is responsible for doing any kind of calculations, whether it be additions or divisions or any kind of logic operations and or whatnot. Those are all the types of building blocks that are being used to then take a program. The program contains all the building blocks that get run in order, more or less. There's exceptions where you can jump around in a program, execute different statements. But basically the central processing unit takes the program, takes the code, processes it, and then does whatever it's told to do. So in a calculator example, if you type in 2 plus 2, then the central processing unit, apart from analyzing the input presses and taking the input from the peripheral interface chip, interpreting it, and then adding the two together, and then spitting out the result basically. So that would be a very simple form of a central processing unit, but it's responsible for the actual addition part and then coming up with the result. In order to do so, the central processing unit needs to somehow store the program, and also it needs work memory. So for example, if you go back to the calculator example, if you were to punch in 2 plus 2, then the computer would use its code, which in the old days was stored in ROM, which is short for read-only memory, which means you can look at it as like the old school game cartridges where the code on the cartridge cannot be changed, hence read-only memory. So the calculator would then look up code in this read-only memory and execute the instructions that it found in the read-only memory and execute them. Now the work memory, or the RAM, which stands for random access memory, is used to write and read information. So going back to the calculator example, if you type in 2 plus 2, it could potentially take the 2 plus 2, figure out what 2 plus 2 is, and then store the result in memory so that at some later point, let's say you want to do another multiplication or something with the existing result, with the 2 plus 2 result, then you could store the 2 plus 2 in memory. And if the central processing unit gets another command that says, okay, now multiply it by 5, then the CPU could go back to that random access memory, look at, okay, what was the last result that I stored? It gets the number 4, and then it multiplies it with a new input from the user, which would be number 5, and it could then store the result back into that random access memory, which then would be 20. So now that same piece of random access memory would store or would contain number 20 instead of number 4 previously. So again, read-only memory is usually to store programs. They're also used to store graphics. So for old computers, I will go over this in greater detail in the later section of this episode. It would store things like sprites. It would store background data. It would also store things like sound data. I'll cover that later on in the episode as well. And any other kind of data, like maybe if there are some enemies, if it's a game with enemies and they have like hit points or attack strength, that kind of thing. Those types of things would all be stored in the read-only memory that could be accessed by the CPU at any time. So things that don't change basically get read from read-only memory. Anything that's being processed where the result may be current health or current player color, if you have a configurable system where the player can choose their own colors, those kind of things, those things all get stored in random access memory so that they stick around later on when the CPU needs to have access to them. It's called random access because at any time the CPU can either read or write any part of that memory. Could also be at any memory location. Memory is basically a segment of address space. The more memory you have, the bigger games you can store because there's more information that can be held. So memory is really just like a large container that the CPU can use to store different things. And read-only memory, in modern computers, you would use a hard drive or a CD or a DVD to read from. So random access memory is the working memory. Read-only memory is memory that cannot be changed. It's synonymous with CD or DVDs in modern days, or just hard drive memory if you download a game. In which case, obviously, it could still be changed, but the idea is that you read only the data, such as graphics and such, things that don't change, from a piece of memory. And as is indicated in the chart, RAM can go both directions. The CPU can store data and read from it, whereas ROM is really just a one-way direction from ROM back to the CPU. That brings us to the next piece of your computer. And even in the old days, in modern days, I'm sure most of you have heard of GPUs. What GPUs do, they're the graphics processing units. In the old days, believe it or not, they also had GPUs, but they were much simpler. They were usually meant for 2D graphics, like sprites. Again, I'll cover sprites a little bit later, but basically think of a player character that's on the screen that needs to be drawn against a background. And instead of constantly erasing what has been written to the background already and then redrawing it and using the central processing unit to do this kind of stuff, you can use, in modern days, the GPU. In the old days, for the Super Nintendo, it was called like PPU, the picture processing unit. At the TI-99 4A was called VDP, something like video display processing chip or something like that. But they're all kind of forms of GPUs. They basically take the workload off the CPU specifically for graphics. So anytime something gets drawn to the screen, gets updated, animated, that kind of thing, the GPU can help in taking the workload of the CPU to free up additional horsepower for the CPU so it can deal with other things like physics and those kind of things, sound or what have you, for processing those things and not being busy drawing graphics all the time. Drawing graphics is very expensive. That's why almost every console or computer has a dedicated graphics chip. Going back to last week's episode when I was talking about CGA and EGA, I will cover those a little bit later. In the IBM PC, those weren't really dedicated graphics chips. They were simply a piece of memory that you would still have to use the CPU for to write data into the graphics memory, versus on other architectures, the GPU would be tasked with writing graphics data into graphics memory, so the CPU would be free to do other things, which is also why PC games really didn't look that great until the CPU was actually getting faster, until eventually they introduced dedicated graphics processing or GPUs for the PC. So that's why PC games were always kind of slowish, not looking as good as Commodore Amiga, for example, or even the Commodore 64 when it came to video games, which required quick graphics. 60 Hz updates or so, 60 times per second the frame would change to make a smooth, flowing, a good-looking arcade game. The other piece of the puzzle is the sound chip. Now, the sound chip is dedicated to make sound, just like the GPU, more or less. But there are vastly different ways to create sound. In modern days, a lot of sound is simply recorded. They record like a snippet of a piano, for example. Then they would take that snippet and they would pitch it up and down to change the frequency of the piano sound. And that way you could, just with one sample, you could reproduce the sound across the keyboard. If you pitch it up and down too much, it doesn't sound natural anymore. So people would traditionally store multiple samples for different pitches to get a better recreation of sound. In the early days, FM sound synthesis, frequency modulated sound synthesis, was more popular, which was in a sense simpler hardware. It could be implemented in analog hardware where you take different frequencies and you modulate them together, hence frequency modulation, to synthesize sounds. So while it was harder to get realistic sounding instruments, it was easier to get a large variety of instruments by simply changing pitches and also filtering the sounds. Maybe put emphasis on low frequencies or high frequencies to change the appearance of the sound, if you will. Different computers had different sound chips. The Commodore 64 was very popular for its sound interface device. I think that's the right name for it. Also called SID. It was one chip where lots of early computer music legends were born. If you just Google Commodore 64 music legends, I'm sure it'll come up with a few names you may recognize. So now let's talk about sprites. Sprites are basically little images that move around on the screen. These can either be implemented in software, such as was the case on earlier PC hardware that didn't have dedicated graphics hardware, or they could be implemented in hardware, as was the case with the NES, the Commodore 64, the Commodore Amiga, the TI-99 4A. Most early video game consoles had some form of sprite support built into the system in hardware, so the CPU could be left alone to do more important things. Now look at the example that I put up here on the screen. It's a TI-99 4A game called Parsec. You can see what I mean by images moving around on the screen. I mean the player ship to the left, which shoots at the enemies to the right. And you can see that that animation is much smoother than, for example, the background at the bottom, which is a scrolling background, which is not implemented in sprites. So the scrolling background was implemented probably in software. Looks like the drawing is kind of laggy, if you will. But the hardware sprites, the spaceships, are animated very smooth. That's pretty much the effect you get when you move drawing sprites onto dedicated hardware, is that you get smooth animation and the CPU can do other things with its time. In this next picture you can see how sprites are being generated. They're pretty much drawn by hand, pixel by pixel, to give the illusion of some kind of a game character or ammunition or spaceships. Any image you would like to move on the screen to make your video game can be implemented in Sprites. Okay, now let's go back to our diagram and let's look at the overall architecture and how these things play together. So the user operates keyboard, mouse, or joystick, which then gets fed and interpreted by the peripheral interface, and whatever it determines has been pressed or moved gets sent to the CPU on request. The CPU then uses its RAM and ROM to analyze what just happened and then react appropriately by driving or telling the GPU and the sound chip what graphics and what sound respectively to produce, and the user would then perceive that reaction on the screen and the speakers or headphones. And that's really kind of the whole circle, and then based on that the user would input another command via keyboard, mouse, or joystick, and the cycle continues. So the overall architecture for just about every computer is pretty much more or less what I was drawing here in this diagram. Alright then, it's a little after 2 AM. I'm done eating my spicy salami snack. That concludes episode 1.5, and as promised, next week's episode will be about Double Dragon for the Atari Lynx. That was a very fun project. More about it in next week's episode. I hope you'll tune in and leave me some comments, like, subscribe. I'll see you next week. Adios.